feel like I really understand that we have a responsibility to change the narrative around what we are delivering to young people in the classroom. But I would describe the actual day-to-day learning side of things very challenging.
Every royal family needs an outsider, someone who slips through the gates without a title stamped on their birth certificate, and somehow ends up belonging anyway. For Princess Beatrice, that outsider turned out to be a tall, sharply dressed property developer with an Italian surname most people still can't pronounce on the first try. He arrived in the tabloids in 2019 looking like a footnote to someone else's story. 6 years later, he's the father of 3 children, the head of a property empire, and quite possibly the steadiest man in a family that has spent the better part of a decade lurching from one crisis to the next. So who is Edoardo Mapelli Mozzi? Not the Instagram version, not the Count Who Charmed a Princess headline version. The real one. Because underneath the tailored suits and the renovated townhouses is a story with a broken engagement, a son born before the royal romance even started, a wedding the public wasn't allowed to watch, and a family scandal that keeps finding new ways to resurface. Let's get into it. Say the name slowly, and it sounds like it belongs in a Renaissance oil painting rather than a modern London office. Edoardo Mapelli Mozzi. There's a reason for that. His family's connection to Italian nobility isn't some flimsy internet rumor. It's documented. Back in 1913, King Victor Emmanuel III granted the hereditary title of Count of the Kingdom of Italy to Edoardo's great-grandfather, Paolo Mapelli Mozzi, with the title passing down through every male descendant in the line. Italy formally abolished the monarchy in 1946 and stripped noble titles of any legal standing a couple of years later. But that hasn't stopped families like his from continuing to use the title socially. It's less a legal fact at this point and more an inherited piece of identity, the kind of thing you don't just let go of because a government changed its mind about monarchies decades ago. His father, Alessandro Alex Mapelli Mozzi, lived a life that reads like it was written for the screen. Born and raised across Argentina, Italy, and England, Alex competed as an alpine skier for Great Britain at the 1972 Winter Olympics before pivoting into a career as an international art dealer. It was actually at a ski resort in Verbier, Switzerland, back in the early 1970s, that Alex first crossed paths with a young Sarah Ferguson, decades before anyone could have guessed their children would one day marry each other. That single detail is worth sitting with for a second. The Mapelli Mozzis and the Yorks weren't strangers brought together by a chance royal encounter. Their families had been orbiting each other since before Edoardo or Beatrice were even born. The family still holds onto Villa Mapelli Mozzi, a centuries-old estate near Castelnuovo in northern Italy, not far from Milan. Depending on which report you read, the property started life as a monastery and today functions partly as a private family home and partly as a luxury retreat, sprawling grounds, more bedrooms than most hotels, the kind of place that looks like a movie set for a story about old European money. And in a sense, that's exactly what it is. But Edoardo isn't a man coasting on inherited stone walls and a title with no legal teeth. He built something of his own, and that's really where his story gets interesting. Edoardo was born on November 19, 1983, at the Portland Hospital in London, a maternity hospital with a long history of catering to Britain's wealthiest families. His mother, Nikki Williams Ellis, carved out her own path through politics, charity work, and design circles, later remarrying more than once and expanding the family tree considerably. Edoardo has an older sister, Natalia, and a younger half-brother, Albemarle Albie Shale, from his mother's marriage to businessman and conservative politician Christopher Shale. His education tracked a fairly predictable path for someone of his background. The Dragon School in Oxford, then Radley College, and eventually a master's degree in politics from the University of Edinburgh. What he did after that, though, wasn't predictable at all for a 20-something with a title and a trust fund waiting in the wings. At just 23 years old, he founded Bonda Property, a development and interior design firm aimed squarely at London's high end of the housing market. The pitch was straightforward. Buy up underappreciated pockets of the city, transform them into polished, design-forward homes, and sell to buyers who don't blink at 8-figure price tags. Over the years, Bonda built a reputation for sleek, almost theatrical interiors The kind of homes that look more like boutique hotels than places where people actually raise kids. Edoardo, who has spoken publicly about being dyslexic, a trait he shares with Beatrice, leaned hard into the visual and spatial side of the business rather than the paperwork side, and it paid off. By the time he was showing up on red carpets next to a princess, Banda had reportedly overseen property developments worth several £100 million. He hasn't been a quiet businessman either. Ahead of London's 2016 mayoral election, he wrote an opinion piece pushing for more central London redevelopment, and he wasn't shy about naming names on social media, criticizing politicians including Andrea Leadsom and Jeremy Corbyn. On the night of the 2016 U.S. presidential election, he publicly voiced support for Hillary Clinton. It's a strikingly different posture than the practiced neutrality most people expect from anyone adjacent to the royal family. Edoardo has never really tried to disappear into the background. That said, not everything Banda has touched has turned to gold. Critics, including writers at Forbes, have pushed back on the company's branding around developing undervalued parts of London, pointing out that a project located in Notting Hill, one of the most expensive postcodes in the country, hardly fits that description. And overseas, Banda's ambitions ran into real trouble. The company was linked to a planned luxury beachfront development on Australia's Gold Coast that was promoted with plenty of fanfare before the venture behind it collapsed into administration. It was, by most accounts, a genuine setback, the kind of story that could dent a developer's reputation. Edoardo, for his part, has largely kept moving, still building, still appearing at industry conferences, still positioning himself as one of the more visible young names in luxury property development. The business side of Edoardo's life is really only half the picture, though. Long before Banda made headlines and long before Beatrice entered his life, he had already been through a relationship and a breakup that would end up shaping everything that came after. Before Princess Beatrice, there was Dara Huang. She's an American architect, Harvard-educated, and by the time she and Edoardo were together, already building an internationally recognized career of her own. The two got engaged around 2014, and in 2016, they had a son together, Christopher Wolf Mapelli Mozzi, known to virtually everyone as Wolfie. By 2018, though the engagement had ended, neither Dara nor Edoardo has ever laid out the specifics of the split publicly, which, compared to the way plenty of high-profile breakups get dragged through the press, is a fairly dignified way to handle things. What is clear is that they separated, they share custody of Wolfie, and Dara went on to found her own successful venture, HB Design Group. Here's the detail that tends to catch people's attention. Within a matter of months of the split from Dara, Edoardo was already dating Princess Beatrice. The timing has fueled plenty of speculation over the years about how much overlap there might have been between the end of one relationship and the beginning of the next, though nothing has ever been confirmed publicly by either party, and there's no solid evidence either way. What we do know is that Wolfie didn't disappear from Edoardo's life once the relationship with Beatrice became serious. Quite the opposite. Beatrice has, by all accounts, embraced her role as Wolfie's stepmother, and the co-parenting arrangement between Dara and Edoardo has been described as genuinely amicable. Dara has posted about spending holidays with Wolfie, and there's no indication of any ongoing conflict between the two households. If anything, it's one of the more functional blended family arrangements you'll find anywhere near a royal family. That backstory, the previous engagement, the son, the quick transition into a new relationship, set the stage for everything that followed. But how exactly did a property developer with an Italian title end up falling for a York princess in the first place? The popular image of a royal romance usually involves some kind of meet-cute, a chance encounter at a party, a spark neither person saw coming. That's not really what happened here. The Mapelli Mozzi family and the Yorks, Andrew and Sarah Ferguson, had been close for decades by the time Edoardo and Beatrice's relationship became public. When their engagement was announced in 2019, Edoardo's mother released a statement noting that her family had known Beatrice for most of her life. These weren't two strangers introduced through friends. They were two people who had likely crossed paths at the same social events for years without it ever turning romantic. Then, sometime around September 2018, something shifted. Both of them were freshly out of previous relationships, Edoardo's engagement to Dara had just ended, and Beatrice had split from her long-term partner Dave Clark back in 2016. The press didn't pick up on the new relationship until November 2018, by which point it was already well underway. Their first confirmed public appearance together came in March 2019, when Beatrice attended a fundraising event at the National Portrait Gallery in London with Edoardo at her side. That single appearance set off a wave of tabloid curiosity. Who was this well-dressed developer standing next to a princess? 2 months later, in May 2019, the two attended the wedding of Lady Gabriella Windsor together, effectively confirming to anyone paying attention that the relationship was serious. By September 2019, Edoardo had proposed during a trip to Italy, with a custom engagement ring designed alongside British jeweler Sean Lean. On September 26, 2019, Buckingham Palace made it official. Princess Beatrice was engaged to Edoardo Mapelli Mozzi. Their joint statement was almost strikingly ordinary for a royal announcement. A simple line about being excited to start their life together, given how much turbulence was about to hit their wedding plans. That low-key tone turned out to be more fitting than anyone could have predicted. The original plan for Beatrice and Edoardo's wedding looked like a fairly standard royal affair. A ceremony at the Chapel Royal of St. James's Palace on May 29, 2020, followed by a reception in the gardens of Buckingham Palace. It would have been photographed extensively, covered by every royal outlet in the country, and treated as one more milestone in a family that has never shied away from pageantry. Then two things happened in quick succession that upended those plans entirely. First came the fallout from Prince Andrew's now infamous November 2019 BBC interview, in which he attempted to address his friendship with a convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein. The interview went so badly that Andrew was forced to step back from public royal duties almost immediately afterward. The consequences rippled outward to his daughters, and Beatrice's wedding planning was scaled back considerably. A smaller, quieter ceremony went from being a nice-to-have to something closer to a necessity, given the circumstances surrounding her father. Then, just months later, the COVID-19 pandemic shut the country down entirely. The planned Chapel Royal ceremony was postponed, and the Buckingham Palace garden reception was scrapped outright. When Beatrice and Edoardo finally did marry, it was on July 17, 2020, at the Royal Chapel of All Saints in Windsor Great Park, a small, private ceremony attended only by immediate family, held with so little advance notice that most of the public didn't even know it had happened until it was already over. In an odd way, the scaled-down ceremony ended up carrying more emotional weight than the original grand plan might have. Beatrice wore a vintage gown that had belonged to her grandmother, Queen Elizabeth II, an ivory silk taffeta dress originally designed by Norman Hartnell in 1962, which the Queen had worn decades earlier to the premiere of Lawrence of Arabia. She also wore the Queen's diamond, a fringe tiara, the very piece Her Majesty had worn at her own wedding back in 1947. In a ceremony stripped of nearly every trapping of a typical royal wedding, Beatrice ended up wearing two of the most historically significant pieces in the entire family's collection. Prince Andrew did walk Beatrice down the aisle, but he was notably absent from the official wedding photographs released afterward, a detail that said plenty without anyone needing to spell it out. The message seemed clear. This day belonged to Beatrice and Edoardo, not to the scandal swirling around her father. Married life moved quickly after that quiet ceremony. Beatrice and Edoardo initially settled into a 4-bedroom apartment at St. James's Palace, modest by royal standards, even if it would sound extravagant to almost anyone else. Neither of them holds the title of a working royal, which means no official public duties and no automatic state funding tied to their day-to-day lives. Beatrice has continued working in the private sector, holding a role as Vice President of Strategic Partnerships at a software company, while Edoardo keeps running Bonda. In a family known for ribbon cuttings and official engagements, the two of them stand out as people with actual day jobs. In late 2022, the family relocated again, moving out of St. James's Palace entirely and into a converted farmhouse in the Cotswolds, complete with tennis courts and an outdoor pool. Reports have put the property's value in the millions, and it's become something of a countryside retreat, with the family splitting time between the Cotswolds and London, depending on the school calendar. the family itself kept growing. In September 2021, Beatrice gave birth to their first daughter together, Sienna Elizabeth Mapelli Mozzi, at the Chelsea and Westminster Hospital in London. Sienna was christened at the Chapel Royal at St. James's Palace the following spring. At birth, she sat 11th in line to the British throne. After Queen Elizabeth II's death in September 2022, she moved up to 10th. Then, in October 2024, came the announcement that the family was expanding again. The pregnancy came with a genuine scare. Beatrice gave birth prematurely, several weeks ahead of schedule, to their second daughter, Athena Elizabeth Rose Mapelli Mozzi, on January 22, 2025, again at Chelsea and Westminster Hospital. Beatrice has spoken publicly about how frightening the early arrival was, and she went on to take up a patronage with Born, a charity focused on preventing premature births, describing the experience as deeply personal to her. Athena was christened at the Chapel Royal at St. James's Palace in December 2025. 3 children, 2 households, and by most public accounts, a genuinely functional co-parenting arrangement with Edoardo's ex, Dara. It's not the kind of blended family structure royal watchers are used to seeing discussed so openly, and it's arguably one of the more grounded parts of an otherwise chaotic family story. No account of Princess Beatrice's family life is complete without acknowledging the long shadow cast by her father. Prince Andrew's association with Jeffrey Epstein has followed the family for years, and it resurfaced with renewed intensity when further documents connected to the Epstein case were released, drawing fresh attention to old correspondence and old questions. Beatrice herself has appeared in some of the released material in relatively minor, incidental ways. Being mentioned as present during a conversation is not the same as being accused of wrongdoing, but in an environment where scrutiny is already high, any mention near the Epstein name is enough to draw renewed press attention. Andrew's position within the royal family has continued to erode. He has been stripped of his public royal duties, lost the use of his styles and titles, and is now more commonly referred to in official contexts by his birth name rather than his former ducal title. A significant shift from the man who once walked his daughter down the aisle as the Duke of York. Beatrice and Edoardo have navigated this without appearing to distance themselves from Andrew entirely, but also without publicly defending him, a careful, uncomfortable middle ground that they seem to occupy quietly, without much public complaint on either side. Through all of it, by most accounts, Edoardo has kept his head down and kept working, showing up to industry events, continuing to grow Bonda, and generally staying out of the fray surrounding his father-in-law. Whatever else can be said about him, he hasn't used the family's turbulence as an opportunity to grab headlines of his own, which in a family this scrutinized might be its own kind of achievement. As of 2026, Edoardo Mapelli Mozzi is in his 40s, running a property company with a track record that includes both genuine successes and at least one high-profile international setback, married to a princess who holds a real job outside the palace system, and raising 3 children across 2 households. Beatrice, meanwhile, continues to sit within the line of succession, a position that has shifted over the years as the family has changed, while balancing her own career with motherhood and the ongoing complexities of her father's situation. Their story doesn't fit into the traditional mold of a royal fairy tale, and it was never really trying to. It's a story shaped as much by a broken engagement and a premature birth and a canceled public wedding as it is by tiaras and vintage gowns. What seems to have held it together, more than anything else, is a kind of steadiness. 2 people who, by most public accounts, just kept showing up for each other and for their kids, even while everything around them kept shifting. That, in the end, might be the most accurate way to describe the truth about Princess Beatrice's husband. He's not simply the tabloid's mystery count from 2019, and he's not a cardboard cutout of old European nobility marrying into a modern royal family for the optics. He's a businessman who built something of his own, a father managing a blended family across 2 households, and a husband who has weathered scandal, pandemic-forced postponements, and a business collapse without ever losing his footing. Whether that's the most interesting version of a royal love story or simply the most grounded one probably depends on what you're looking for. But it is, as far as the public record shows, the real one.